friend of Dr. Zdzislaw R, who basically went to school with me, a PhD from Columbia, a little bit earlier, who had a great father too. We should have a separate session if I force her finally to write anything down. Yes, he was a fighter and a political prisoner after the war, during and after the war. But now we have Mr. Adam Zieliński, who will introduce himself differently because he always mispronounces his name. His native melodious with the Anglo-Saxon ear. That's really his name. He's the 8th administrator of the U.S. Energy Information Administration. And he knows everything there is to know about energy. He also worked in the private sector, for instance, for Deutsche Bank. Bless you, Gesundheit, whichever one applies. Anyway, he also worked for something called the National Petroleum Council, which is an advisory group to the Secretary of Energy. Well, not surprisingly, when we have asked Mr. Zieliński to come talk to us, he said, "Can I talk about energy?" If you must.
I'll say something about Poland too.
Oh, okay, say something about Poland. Because Poland needs energy, although when we run out of carbohydrates, Poland's just fine with coal, so it won't get cold in Poland. Anyway, please welcome our speaker. Thank you.
So just use the down key. Thank you very much, Marek. It's a pleasure to be here.
Forward with the arrow key.
Right. I'm delighted to be here. The Institute of World Politics, but more importantly, the Kosciuszko Chair Conference. I might be able to find a picture that I brought with me at the end of my presentation of me putting an American flag on top of the flowers at Kosciuszko's tomb in Krakow a few years ago. It was July 4th, and I thought that since Thomas Jefferson made Kosciuszko an American citizen, he deserved to have an American flag on the 4th of July. So I had it hidden in my jacket. I went in. I was not arrested, I'm delighted to say. I think that if I had been seen putting the American flag there, I probably would have been perfectly accepted. It was a lot of fun. Well, what I want to talk about today is the energy outlook for the world, including some of the things that are going on in Poland. But before I do that, I just want to have 2 slides to tell you about the agency that I run. It's called the U.S. Energy Information Administration. We are one of the 14 major federal statistical organizations in Washington. Most of the major cabinet agencies have a statistical branch. Now, there's transportation statistics, health statistics. At the Department of Justice, they actually have crime statistics. So at Energy, we have energy statistics, and we're responsible. EIA, my organization, by law, no other policy group in Washington can review our data, our analysis, and our reports go out even without review by the Secretary of Energy. They don't go to the Congress, to the energy committees. They don't go to the White House. That's a bit different than many of the other parts of cabinet agencies. So we're the official source of information. We don't take policy stances, try to stay out of the policy arena, but we like to comment on things that matter to policymakers. So we do lots of reports, and here's an example of weekly reports on natural gas storage and things like gasoline supply and demand balances, many monthly reports on energy, natural gas, drilling productivity, and a number of other things, and 2 big annual reports, one on the international energy outlook and one on the U.S. energy outlook. We're also the first agency anywhere in the world to be collecting data on an hourly basis. We're looking at the generation of electricity across the United States, and we're sweeping it from a number of what they call balancing authorities, these big groups that make sure the grid operates correctly. We're the first statistical agency anywhere in the world to collect things on an hourly basis. So we've gone way beyond mailing out paper forms for people to fill out and send them back in. That's what was happening in the 1970s to bringing things in on an electronic basis. We have lots of people that use our site, private citizens, businesses, the energy sector itself, the financial markets, schools, government itself, and the media. Millions and millions of hits on our website, and I'm very proud of what we're doing electronically. We were the first agency in Washington to actually have a website. We're now the first agency to have a LinkedIn page, a Facebook page, and a Twitter account. So we're keeping up with the millennials. Let me talk a little bit about Poland's energy situation. Poland's primary energy consumption is about 4 quadrillion BTUs. Just to put that into perspective, the U.S. consumes about 100. So 4 Qs is a fairly big number. Coal accounts for about half of domestic consumption. Oil and natural gas split the rest. There's a little bit of renewables. The Polish government actually has a target to raise that renewables number to something like 15%. But coal is still extremely important in Poland. 150 million short tons of coal. It's 22% of the coal production in Europe. Poland's the largest coal producer in Europe behind Germany. The electricity sector in Poland is very reliant on coal for creating electricity, about 75% of installed capacity. Again, to kind of compare that to the United States, 10 years ago, about half of the electricity in the United States was generated with coal, and that number is now down to about 1/3. And the reason is that we're using a lot more natural gas to generate electricity, and increasingly more renewables like wind and solar. The potential to use other sources of energy in Poland besides coal is improving. Poland's largest source of crude oil, it's about 500,000 barrels a day. And I'm going to keep comparing to the United States. The U.S. consumes about 20 million barrels a day. So about 500,000 barrels a day is a pretty big number. There are 2 big refineries in Poland. Most of that oil in Poland is coming from Russia through the Druzhba pipeline. Friendship, I think, is what that might mean in Russian. And whether it's friendly or not, I'm not so sure. Marek might he might have an opinion on that. There are other sources of oil now coming in Poland, Saudi Arabia, Iraq. Interestingly, the United States now has no laws that constrain the export of crude oil. We don't have any laws that constrain the export of natural gas. This is something new for the United States. So it's possible that Poland could even get crude oil from the United States. Whether that would be economic or not, I think, would depend on a lot of things. Poland's natural gas supply, again, most of that there is some domestic production. That's the blue bars down at the bottom. The yellow gold color is pipeline imports, and that's coming from Russia. I know that Poland took a stand against one of the new big pipelines that the Russians were talking about building into Europe. Poland being on the western side of the Ukraine, there's all the big pipelines come through that way, through Poland, and there's lots of interesting security questions associated with that. Later on, if you want to look at this, you can see some of the statistics about Poland's rank in the global markets. The biggest thing is its reserves and consumption of coal. Interestingly, and it's not on this list, but Poland uses a lot of propane fuel. So that's the tank that's under your barbecue here in the United States, but in Poland it's being used in the transportation area. So there are a lot of LPG cars and trucks in Poland, and it's one of the world's ranking leaders in that area. Now I want to talk a little bit about the world and a little bit about the United States, and I'm going to go through these very quickly, and I hope you might have some questions for me. I'd rather get into a dialogue with you than look at these. This is the world picture for the supply and demand of crude oil. Everybody, the main thing that everybody in America wants to know about, it seems, and it's the biggest thing that we get on our website, is what's the price of gasoline, right? The price of gasoline depends mainly on the price of crude oil. The price of crude oil depends on what the supply and demand balance is. And what you see here, that blue line, is all the way through the end of 2014 and 2015, supply was exceeding consumption. Inventories, those green bars, were building, and that was putting downward pressure on oil prices. That's why oil prices fell from over $100 a barrel in the middle of 2014 to well below $50 a barrel in the end of 2015 and earlier this year. Prices have recovered a little bit, and we're now trading around $45 a barrel or so for something called the Brent benchmark price that analysts use to try to capture in one number what the price of oil is. We don't see at EIA these supply and demand numbers balancing until about the second quarter of next year. That's the point that we would expect prices to begin to firm up. Inventories are very high, so even if we had a problem somewhere in one of the supplying countries around the world, there's a lot of inventory to draw on, but things could tighten up. And just as an example, the political situation in Venezuela is a complete mess. Venezuela exports a couple of million, 2 million barrels a day into the world markets, and if that production should be lost, it could create a pretty big move in prices around the world. So I want to just show you something. EIA says that the price of oil will average about $51 or $52 next year. So we have what we call point forecasts. But what this graph shows, and the one on the right-hand side is for oil, is that the range, the possible range in prices is very high. We use a very sophisticated algorithm called Black-Scholes that was originally used in the financial markets to try to look at what the volatility is of pricing. And there's an advantage in using Black-Scholes because it just uses market information. It uses the price in the futures and options market to determine volatility and then turns that into a range of prices. So it is based on data that's very, very easily available. What the Black-Scholes algorithm says, with a 95% confidence level, that's pretty good, 95% confidence level, that oil will be somewhere between $30 a barrel and $100 a barrel. So you say, what use is something that predicts that? And the answer is, what that's telling you is nobody knows what the price of oil is going to be. Nobody knows what the weather is going to be when the Kosciuszko Chair is having its annual meeting. It seems to be associated with sunshine that keeps those people outside, Marek, but let's not worry about it. Let me just show you this graph that relates per capita income growth and population growth to energy. What we see is demand for energy still climbing very sharply, driven by population and income growth in places like Asia, the Middle East, and Africa. Not so much in the United States and Europe, but in these growing economies, energy demand is still picking up very strongly. So we see demand for oil continuing to rise. We see demand for coal flattening, natural gas rising even faster than oil, renewables growing the fastest. That's the green line. but from a base which is very low. So even though renewables grows very fast, it's still not enough to supply all of the world's demand for energy. We also see nuclear growing, and that's mostly in China. One of the things that energy is going to be used for, so if you go back and look at, where is most of that going, more than half of the world's energy is going into industrial uses. So that's back to this income growth. As income grows, people want cars, they want refrigerators, they want air conditioners, they want big screen TVs, and all of that needs oil, gas, and electricity, and it's many fuels to drive it. I'm going to skip through that. I just want to show you that as time goes by, we see OPEC's role in the oil markets becoming more powerful. Right now, OPEC is struggling to try to do anything about prices, but as we move out into the next decade, demand for OPEC crude oil will begin to grow, and again, that could tighten up oil prices. One of the other things that I just wanted to show very quickly here is the growth over the next few years in something called liquefied natural gas. So if you take natural gas and chill it, it turns into a liquid. It's easy to put that into a ship, into a tanker. It's like a big thermos bottle to keep the liquid cold. And you can move that overseas. And the United States is now beginning to be an exporter of liquefied natural gas. Countries like Malaysia and Australia have been doing it for some time. Over the next few years, we see a lot of growth in the capacity to manufacture liquefied natural gas in the United States, in Australia, Indonesia, and a few other countries. That'll probably keep those markets oversupplied. The reason I bring this up is the potential for using the LNG import facility that was just completed in Poland to purchase U.S. supplied natural gas is now a reality. It could happen. The first shipment of LNG into Poland, into that facility, came from Qatar in the Middle East. But it's certainly possible that the United States could become a supplier to Poland of natural gas. Just a quick point about the global electricity markets, and one of the interesting aspects of this, I mentioned that 75% of the electricity in Poland is coming from coal. A very big proportion of electricity in China also comes from coal. China is the world's largest coal producer and consumer, way exceeding what even the United States does. So these numbers for coal in China are just huge, and what the Chinese government's plans are for its coal industry is something that will make a really big difference to things like air quality in Beijing and elsewhere in China. I was just there last week. The first day of my meetings in Beijing, there were health warnings. Everybody, please stay inside. People were going in the street with wearing masks. The people in China, I think, are particularly interested in finding ways for China to clean up the air pollution problems that they have, and reducing coal consumption is going to be one of those. We see a lot of growth coming in things like natural gas, hydropower, other renewables, wind, solar, and so on, and even nuclear power. We don't see coal growing very much globally, and not in China either. This growth in cleaner fuels is something that I think will even continue under a Trump administration. The need for dealing with air pollution problems is something that most people understand and believe, even if there are doubts about climate issues. That's actually the end of this presentation. These are some of the places that you can go on the web and find EIA's data. So I'm going to do something really quick here, see if I can make this work. Oh, I might need some help. I want to go to this. Can you bring up the file?
Which file?
Go back to this USB key. So just use the file. It's not a PowerPoint, so we're going to just escape from PowerPoint, minimize that. Let's get rid of that. There we go.
All right.
Okay, so now the key.
It's here. It's open.
Right. All right, here's my travel log that I promised you. How do I bring that up? You want to bring it up for me?
Yes.
Whoop, we just lost the connection into the, you know what, it doesn't matter.
What are we trying to do here, Mary?
Can you show that on the screen?
Display it.
There we go. There's me. My grandparents' hometown, Nowy Sącz. I used to call it Nowy Sącz, but somebody told me that my Polish pronunciation wasn't very good, Marek, on that. Then the next one that I want to show you.
We forgive you.
This one, sir.
Yeah. That's Kosciuszko's tomb at the castle in Krakow. And it's hard to see, but that's the American flag I planted in the flowers. Okay. Questions? Complaints?
Thank you for this whistle-stop tour of energy
And we'll keep you on time, too.
challenges and possibilities. I usually make comments. Well, my comment was Poland has coal. Poland shouldn't worry about anything except Brussels, because Brussels moans and complains. But when it gets cold or carbohydrates run out, then the Poles will just use coal. Make no doubt about it. That was just my comment. As is customary, do you have any questions for Mr. S? Madam.
Yes, you mentioned that you use the power grid to generate data and then you collect. Can you explain how the smart meters play a role in the
Right. So smart meters and what's the role there, what's happening with the grid. So there's a really interesting study that's underway at the Department of Energy, not by my agency, but by the Office of Policy. It's called the Quadrennial Energy Review, QER. And Melanie Kenderdine is running this study. It's looking at the electricity grid in the United States and addressing issues like this. So what EIA is doing is we are collecting data on how much electricity is being produced on an hourly basis, and we're showing that about an hour and a half after the conclusion. So right now, if you were to go on our website, you'd be able to see how much electricity was used between 11 o'clock and noon today, and in another few minutes, about 20 minutes after 2, you'd be able to see how much was used between noon and 1 o'clock. So what we can now show is the hourly pattern of electricity generation and demand across the United States. We're going to ask the Office of Management and Budget for permission to further expand this survey that we're doing to include all of the fuels so that we can see how much coal, nuclear, natural gas, and renewables and so on is contributing to the generation of electricity. The smart meters and smart grid is a term that's being used to try to understand better what's actually happening to the electricity as it flows across the grid, and smart meters at your home. So a smart meter in your home, rather than just recording how much electricity you're using, it might be able to do the same thing. Look at your patterns over the course of the day, understand how much electricity is being used for different devices in your home, and relay that information back to the utility so that they can manage how the grid is being used. Meters on the big grid rather than at your house are, in a sense, being used in the same way to try to understand where the electricity is going, how it's being used, and whether or not there would be ways to improve the efficiency of how the grid works. So one of the things America was saying, you know, Poland has a lot of coal and is still going to use coal to generate electricity. Well, there are lots of things that you can do to clean coal up. You can capture the stack gases, you can remove the sulfur, you can even sometimes do something about the nitrogen oxides. In the United States, coal consumption has been falling, and a lot of that hasn't really had anything to do with climate issues. It's had to do with things like getting sulfur dioxide out of the air. That's kind of the smelly, you know, kind of rotten egg smell that you sometimes, I remember from my boyhood in central Pennsylvania in the coal regions. Getting the sulfur out improves health. Getting particulate matter out improves health. One of the things that is underway right now are some regulations on heavy metals like mercury, which are contained in coal and are released when coal is burned, and there are ways to remove metals like mercury from coal. And those things are really all designed to improve public health. It doesn't have anything to do. Now, there are many people who believe that fossil fuels like coal, oil, and natural gas are emitting too much carbon dioxide, that's leading to some serious issues relative to temperature and climate. But there are other reasons for looking at coal. Back to your question, and then I'm going to stop, and I think there was another one. Smart meters might actually be able to figure out a way to improve the efficiency of consumption in your home. It would lead to information that would allow you to make some judgments about when to use electricity, and the same thing is true with the grid. So some people say that the best form of energy is the energy that you don't use. More efficient cars, you know, better mileage from your car, or air conditioners that can give you all of the cold air that you want on a hot day in Washington, but do it with less electricity needed. This is something that Saudi Arabia has been working on. As you might imagine, out in the middle of Saudi Arabia, it's very hot. Everybody has air conditioners. Electricity is pretty cheap, so they use those, but they're trying to find ways to improve the efficiency of the air conditioners that they're buying and installing so that they use less electricity. In the Saudis' case, they use oil to generate their electricity, and if they can save the oil, they can export that to China so that the Chinese can use the oil to drive their cars and trucks, as an example. I think there was another question here. But you should go on the DOE website and look at the Quadrennial Energy Review. Yes, sir.
So I know you said you don't, your administration doesn't get into the policy side of things, but just a couple of questions that maybe you could give us some insight on. With Poland in particular, and then maybe the rest of Europe, particularly like Lithuania, trying to go to the LNG ports. Right. Do you see that would affect Russia in any way and how they view their kind of nearer broad energy markets? And then you were talking, one of the charts talked about India was going to be really one of the only places where coal use is going to go up. Right, in that graph. Mm-hmm. You had mentioned that coal use, as well as other forms of energy for overall energy production, was going up because of industrial uses. Do you also see, looking out particularly in China and India, it's going to get beyond the industrial uses where it'll be more towards kind of quality of life and consumer demand? Right, okay, so the first question was? For LNG. LNG, right, and in Europe.
And is the possibility of U.S. LNG exports having a role somehow globally? The answer to that is absolutely yes. That the availability of an alternative supply at a reasonable price is something that has tended to lead to contract revisions in a lot of places in Asia, and might also have led to competition in Europe. Around the world, outside of the gas in the United States kind of trades against itself, so that they call it gas on gas competition. It tends to keep prices at modest levels. Around the world, natural gas tends to be priced with contracts tied to the oil price. So one of the things that happened when oil prices fell is natural gas prices fell as well. Before that was happening, there were many people, before the oil price came down, the possibility that U.S. liquefied natural gas was going to be available, especially to Asian buyers, was something that was tending to put a cap on prices. I think that U.S. LNG could still put a cap on prices in Europe and offer effective competition. But you have to keep in mind that those huge, huge Russian gas pipelines coming into Europe can be very, very competitive, and trying to compete with very expensive LNG liquefaction and transportation against gigantic, relatively cheap to build pipelines is something that if I were in the LNG business, I wouldn't be counting on being able to penetrate the European markets against Russian gas. One of the things, interestingly, that's helped Russia during the oil price decline is that the ruble fell faster than the dollar. And the costs of producing oil and gas in Russia tend to be in rubles. The revenue that they get for exporting into Europe tends to come in dollars. And the strength of the dollar against the ruble meant that even with the decline in oil and gas prices, the Russian government and producers were getting fairly decent revenue for their product. Your second question was, I didn't get my pen out to write it down.
Going forward in China and India.
Yeah, coal. I had the graph that showed coal demand rising in India, coming down in the United States, with or without the thing that we call the Clean Power Plan that President Obama wanted to put in place, and President-elect Trump has said he doesn't favor it. It would make a difference. With the Clean Power Plan, we would probably see a faster drop in coal consumption, but in EIA's numbers, coal use in the United States is going down because natural gas is very competitive, and renewables are rising as well. So let's look at where in the why coal is going up in other places like India. It is as in Poland, it's a very attractive way of generating electricity. So everybody wants electricity, and even moving away from industrial output towards a service-oriented economy, as China is trying to do in their 13th five-year plan. The need for electricity would still be going up. What was that comment, Merrick? I was just...
This particular stage is called NEP.
Right. They're really interested. The word that they're using all the time in China now is transition.
Yes.
A transition from India has got a long ways to go before they're going to be transitioning to a service-oriented economy.
The Chinese are interested
Right.
in coal as well.
Chinese are very interested in coal. They're also, because of the size of the country and the GDP, they've got very active research going on in ways to use coal cleanly, shale production. By the way, EIA actually did a study through a consultancy. We looked at the possibility of shale in Poland. There's a lot of natural gas shale reserves, we believe, in Poland. We reduced those a little bit in one of our reassessments, but they're still very large. But a lot of the companies that were drilling in 2013 and 2014 had relatively disappointing results, and so the effort to develop shale gas in Poland has pretty dramatically slowed down. Some of the companies say that the problem, there's two kinds of problems in looking for oil and natural gas. There's the geological problems, they call those the below ground issues, and then there's the above ground issues. And the above ground issues are also challenging in Poland. Poland was trying to design contracts that they didn't want to leave a lot of money on the table. And so they designed the contracts very tightly to make sure that the companies weren't getting too much money from the deals that were being structured. And I think it actually slowed down the exploration process. Yes, sir.
What's the energy situation in the Kaliningrad Oblast? Do they have any production, say, lignite? And what they import, where does it come from?
Okay, so let me explain what I do, despite my name. And in Merrick, it's very funny when I go to visit my sister, Mary Sheminsky, in Williamsport, Pennsylvania. We get introduced as Mary Sheminsky and Adam Szymanski. Although when I go to Europe, I find that when I check into hotels that most people actually know how to pronounce my name the correct Polish way. I'm the CEO of EIA. We have a $122 million a year budget. We have 600 people working there. I spend most of my time trying to get senior people hired and get rid of the dead wood, which is really, really hard thing to do in the federal government. I have no idea what the energy situation is in the Kaliningrad Oblast. Maybe somebody here in the room does.
They would be depending on Russia, because it's Russia. It would be against their own interests to pick up anything other than consumer goods and food, which they do in across-the-border trade from Poland.
So does the energy come in by pipeline or by ship?
By ship. And also sometimes it's shipped by, if needs be, by train. There is some kind of a deal with Lithuania, or transit deal, where the Russians have to travel in sealed trains. So it's a transit, I suppose, but the other way around is also applies. They treat Kruleviec, or what they call now Kaliningrad Oblast, as an integral part of Russia. They wanted to be oriented towards Russia. Incidentally, both Kaliningrad and Vladivostok Oblast have tended to be the most outward-looking because they are on the extremes. So the first serious anti-Putin riots occurred both in Königsberg, Kaliningrad, Kruleviec, and in Vladivostok, because those people have business in Japan and in Poland. And once Putin began tightening the noose, there were rebellions in the peripheries. They had to rush riot police from Moscow to Vladivostok. That's how bad it got. They were bringing a lot of stuff from Japan. It's about free trade.
These things called LPGs, liquefied petroleum, it's not LNG, not liquefied natural gas. LPG is like propane. And that comes by train. A lot of it comes from Russia. It goes through Poland into Germany and the Czech Republic. And and as I said, there's a lot of this LPG is being consumed within Poland itself. So Poland is a transportation corridor, and that's a little bit what Marek was referring to. There was, yes, sir.
Is there any clean coal plant in operation in the world that
Is there
that is effective? I've seen one in
Right.
Alaska, but this is in 2012. It looked fresh. It's been there a few years and it's yet to work. And they didn't think they'd ever get it to work.
Yeah, there are.
Is there one working?
There are a number of clean coal. The Department of Energy has been sponsoring through loans and other activities, clean coal activities. Some are better than others. The most recent interesting one is Southern Company, which is a big electric utility in the South in the United States, has a big coal plant called Kemper. It uses lignite. So a lot of that available in places like Germany and Poland. Takes that, converts it to, using steam, converts that into hydrogen and methane, burns that to make the electricity, captures the carbon dioxide as a side stream. Now they're not getting all of the CO2, the carbon dioxide, but they're getting about 2/3 of it, and they're taking that and pumping it through a pipeline to an old oil field, and they're using the carbon dioxide to get more oil out of the ground. So there are some places where that's working. The Japanese have some very sophisticated clean coal plants, and as I said, I think China has been working on that as well. Okay.
Last question.
Last question. The moderator is going to take the last question.
And, you can leave us, but there is a real security concern in the intermarium because of Russia's dominance and its cheap oil and gas. Everyone's looking for an alternative energy source. We've mentioned shale gas. There's also a great American invention, miniature reactors, which the current and previous administrations didn't like too much. Thorium, which are supposed to be
the
safe.
thorium cycle.
So the Poles,
Right.
or a few conservative Poles, like the idea. I don't know about the current government, but this could also be not only for the Poles, but anybody from Bulgaria to Estonia could look at thorium and thorium reactors, miniature. Apparently in California, there is a company that comes up with a truck-size reactor
Right.
that can service an entire town.
Right.
Except we can't use it in the U.S.
So there is a name for these things, small modular reactors, SMRs. The idea is that they would be maybe 15 or 20% of the size of the typical nuclear plant that's being built. That would have two advantages. It would have lower capital costs because it's smaller, maybe three. It would be easier to site. And more standardized construction, and then third, these things would have fuel cycles that are safer. Current uranium fuel cycle power plants have to have all kinds of regulations to prevent the misuse of nuclear material. And getting away from that, and the thorium cycle would be one way to do that, would be pretty good. I also saw in my flight from Shanghai to San Francisco a half-hour film about the future of energy, where they were talking about the ITER. It's the International something. It's escaping me now, but people are looking at fusion. They're building over in Europe a gigantic magnet. It's going to be about 10 years before the thing is ready, but they think that they're actually going to be able to make some progress on fusion. What the cost is going to be is like still unknown at this point. But the idea of continuing to develop nuclear power in either smaller, better fuel cycles for the typical fission reactors, or possibly moving towards fusion, which would also have a greater safety associated with it, is something that Secretary Moniz the current Secretary of Energy and Secretary Stephen Chu, who was the Secretary between 2009 and 2013, very, very interested in pursuing. And I think that this is something that's, that everybody in the world is looking at, and it's, I think, probably useful to do to complement intermittent renewables with base load generation that's available all the time. So thank you, Dziękuję, and I hope to see you again sometime.